Beautiful Disaster, 2012. Book 1, Chapter 8, Beauty of a Disaster. Doug was walking down the hall on the 3rd floor. Taylor and Tobin followed him. "Mr. Stokes, we need to get to the roof," said Doug as he stepped into the classroom. Mr. Stokes stared at him. There's no way to get to the roof," he said slowly. "Oh yeah?" said Doug, and Mr. Stokes nodded. Tobin turned to Ben and Shane, which entered the room carrying Nick. "What happened to him?" asked Mr. Stokes. "Don't worry about it," said Doug, crossing his arms. "You can't talk to me like that," said Mr. Stokes angrily. "Can I show you something?" asked Doug. Mr. Stokes nodded, and Doug dragged him from the room and into the hall. Doug pointed down the hall towards the staircase with a window behind it, which took up the entire wall. "The water continues to rise. Within the next hour, I feel that window will break, and this floor will be completely underwater," said Doug. Mr. Stokes leaned into to look closely, and saw the window was cracking in some spots. "Yeah, we will go to the roof," said Mr. Stokes, and he turned and began screaming to everyone to wake up. Tobin appeared next to Doug in the hall. "Now, suddenly there is a way onto the roof," said Doug, leaning to Tobin. "I didn't know there was access to the roof," said Tobin. And the two of them entered the classroom and began waking everyone up. Doug noticed Nick staring blankly outside, and Nick turned to him suddenly. "Nick, you coming with us?" asked Doug. "Yeah, I am," said Nick, and Doug motioned him to the door. Doug turned to Tobin, which was helping people to their feet. The next moment the school shook and Doug felt a hand grab his. He turned, looking rather startled, and saw Taylor next to him. "All right, well, let's go," he said, and they turned to the hallway. Meanwhile, Mr. Stokes and many students had reached the science complex. There, behind a classroom, sat a door with the words "Off Limits" on it. "That's the door," said Mr. Stokes. He reached for the doorknob and turned it. There was a click, but the door did not open. Mr. Stokes, problem," said Scott from behind him. And Mr. Stokes turned from the door. "It's locked," he said, and people began screaming and panicking. Doug and Nick stood in the hall. The crowd of students were not moving. "What's going on?" said Doug loudly. Tobin appeared suddenly. "The window, look," he said, and Doug turned to the window at the far end of the hall began to break. The school shook as water poured through the cracks. "Hey, move," said Doug, and he began to push people. Taylor was right by his side as well as Nick and Tobin. It was too crowded to move. "Here, stand back," said Nick, and there was a flash of red, and Nick pulled out the strange beam sword he had. "Get back, move, or you will be cut," said Nick loudly, causing people to back up against the walls. "Come on," said Nick, and he spun the beam sword around in his hand, and Doug, Tobin, and Taylor ran up the stairs after him, after destroying the lock. The window cracked a little bit more, and there was a shake. The next moment screams were heard as the window gave out, and a ton of water rushed down the 3rd floor hallway, swiping people right off their feet. Mr. Stokes pulled on the door that stopped them from getting to the roof. "Open, you bitch," said Mr. Stokes, and a few students giggled. Just then Mr. Stokes turned and Nick appeared along with Doug, Taylor, and Tobin. "Nice of you to show up," came Shane's voice. "Don't have time." "Is it locked?" asked Doug, and Mr. Stokes nodded. "Nick," said Doug, and there was a crash as Nick flipped his beam sword, cutting the lock suddenly. "Great," said Mr. Stokes, as Nick pulled the door open and ran up, followed by a ton of students. The next moment, Doug turned and water hit him. With enough force, he almost lost his grip on Tobin's shoulder and Taylor's hand. "Everyone up now!" screamed Tobin, and people screamed as the water rushed through the science complex. Tobin squeezed his way around people and made it up. "Go up, find Tobin. I'm right behind you," said Doug loudly, and he motioned Taylor through the door. "Doug, hurry up," she screamed, and in the panic of students tripping over each other, she rushed up the staircase to the roof and out of sight. Doug turned on the spot from where Taylor disappeared and saw Ben. He was soaking wet and he was breathing rather heavily. "What's wrong?" asked Doug as Ben took deep breaths. "You have to go up. The water's rising fast, and there isn't enough room on that roof for everyone," said Ben, shaking his head. "What are you going to do?" asked Doug, and Ben pointed at the stairs. "Just go," he said, and Doug stared at him in silence. "Go!" yelled Ben, and Doug turned into the crowd and ran up the stairs. The wind hit his face, and for the first time in hours, Ben pulled a dark pole from his belt, and in a blue flash startled everyone in front of him as Doug turned and saw it. "Back up now!" yelled Ben, looking rather scared. "You can't do that. It's not fair," said a voice, and Ben turned to Doug and nodded. "Get 'em!" yelled a voice, and Ben turned up the stairs, grabbed the doors, and slammed them shut. At this moment, Doug ran forward and tried to pull open the doors to help his friend. Sadly, the doors wouldn't open. He heard a couple bangs, and as he did, Doug reached down to the lock and turned it. There was a click, and Doug turned and came back up the stairs. Nick shut off his beam sword, and he shook his head slowly as he stored it in his pants pocket. Nobody else stared at Doug. Tobin appeared and patted him on the back. "In the end, he did do the right thing," said Tobin. Doug turned to him. "You count everyone up here?" he asked, and Tobin nodded as he mouthed the number 53. Doug turned and looked around at the dark roof. It wasn't very big, but at least they could dry off. Both Tobin and Doug were both confused and frustrated. They needed to sleep now, and this was the perfect time to lay down. To be continued in Chapter 9.